The story opens with 9-year-old Mary Katherine Smart lying frozen in her bed at 1:30 a.m. on June 5th, 2002. Her heart pounding as she watches through squinted eyes while a man in white robes holds a knife to her 14-year-old sister, Elizabeth's throat. The man whispers threats that if Elizabeth makes a sound, he will kill her entire family. Mary Katherine's body trembles beneath her covers, terror paralyzing every muscle as she watches the shadowy figure force Elizabeth out of their bedroom. The screen door creaks, footsteps fade into the darkness, then silence. Mary Katherine's mind screams at her to move, to call for help, but fear roots her to the mattress. Minutes pass like hours. When she finally finds her voice, she stumbles to her parents' room and speaks words that will shatter their world forever. Someone took Elizabeth. This single moment launches one of the most bizarre kidnapping cases in American history. A 9-month nightmare that will test faith, fracture a family's trust in law enforcement, and reveal the terrifying power of psychological manipulation. The narrative rewinds slightly to establish the normalcy of the Smart household on the evening of June 4th, 2002. The family of 6 gathered in their comfortable Salt Lake City home for evening prayers, a sacred ritual in their devout Mormon household. Edward Smart, a real estate broker with a gentle demeanor and strong faith, led the prayers while his wife Lois sat nearby, her eyes closed in reverence. Their children, Tom, Elizabeth, Mary Katherine, and the younger siblings bowed their heads. Elizabeth, at 14, was the picture of innocence. Blonde hair pulled back, modest dress, her face reflecting the sheltered upbringing her parents had carefully cultivated. She had just returned from playing her harp at an awards ceremony, proud of her accomplishment. The family shared stories from their day, laughed together, and prepared for bed. Edward checked the doors, a routine safety measure, though in their safe neighborhood it seemed almost unnecessary. The children brushed their teeth, changed into pajamas, and climbed into bed. Elizabeth and Mary Katherine shared a room, their beds positioned near the window. The house settled into peaceful silence. The narrative then moves to the moment of intrusion, detailing the abductor's calculated approach. Bryan David Mitchell, though readers don't yet know his identity, had been watching the Smart home for weeks. He knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, their habits. On this night, he made his move with chilling precision. He approached the kitchen window, a screen covering that appeared secure but was actually easy to manipulate. Using a knife, he carefully cut through the screen, the soft tearing sound barely audible in the night air. The window was high off the ground, requiring him to stack chairs from the patio to reach it. His movements were methodical, practiced. He had done this before, not here, but in other homes, other lives he had invaded. Once inside, he moved through the darkened kitchen like a ghost, his white robes flowing silently behind him. He knew where the children's bedrooms were located. He had researched this family thoroughly, selecting Elizabeth specifically for reasons that combined religious delusion, sexual deviance, and a twisted sense of divine mission. Mary Katherine's paralyzed terror is explored in visceral detail. The narrative enters her young mind, capturing the confusion of a 9-year-old child trying to process an incomprehensible horror. She heard the man's whispered threats so specific and terrifying that they froze her completely. He told Elizabeth that if she screamed or resisted, he would kill her and every member of her family. Mary Katherine watched through barely open eyes as Elizabeth, wearing her favorite red pajamas, was forced out of bed. Elizabeth's face showed terror, but also a strange composure, as if she understood that compliance was her only chance of survival. The man's hand gripped her arm firmly, but not violently. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made the situation even more surreal and frightening. Mary Katherine wanted to scream, to jump up and fight, to save her sister, but her body wouldn't obey. Fear paralyzed her so completely that she couldn't even move her fingers. She listened as the footsteps receded, as the screen door in the kitchen creaked open, as the house returned to its eerie silence. Time became elastic for Mary Katherine. She lay in bed, her sister's empty bed just feet away, trying to convince herself it had been a nightmare. Maybe Elizabeth had just gone to the bathroom. Maybe she had imagined the whole thing. But the empty bed mocked her desperate hope. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 15 or 20 minutes, Mary Katherine found the courage to move. She crept out of her bedroom, her bare feet silent on the carpet, and made her way to her parents' room. Her knock was timid at first, then more insistent. Lois Smart woke first, groggy and confused by her young daughter's presence. When Mary Katherine spoke the words, "Someone took Elizabeth," Lois's first reaction was disbelief. It had to be a bad dream, a child's confused imagination. But Mary Katherine's terror was too real, too visceral. Edward woke and immediately went to check the girl's bedroom. Elizabeth's bed was indeed empty. A thorough search of the house confirmed the worst. Elizabeth was gone. The 911 call is recreated with emotional precision. Lois's voice trembled as she tried to explain to the dispatcher that her daughter had been taken, that this wasn't a runaway situation, that an intruder had entered their home and abducted their child. Edward grabbed the phone, his voice cracking as he provided details. Their address, his daughter's description, the urgency of the situation. The dispatcher remained calm, professional, but even through the phone line, the gravity of the situation was palpable. Police were dispatched immediately. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet Salt Lake City night. Squad cars converged on the Smart home, their flashing lights painting the neighborhood in alternating red and blue. Officers entered the house, their faces serious as they began asking questions, taking statements, securing the scene. The initial police response is detailed with all its chaos and confusion. Officers searched the house room by room, looking for any sign of forced entry, any clue about the abductor's identity. They found the cut screen in the kitchen window. The chairs stacked outside, clear evidence of an intruder. But the scene had already been compromised. Family members had walked through the house, touched surfaces, moved objects in their frantic search for Elizabeth. The officers tried to preserve what evidence remained, but valuable forensic opportunities had already been lost. The neighborhood was sealed off quickly, with officers going door to door, waking residents, asking if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Most had been asleep. No one reported seeing a man in white robes carrying a teenage girl through the streets in the middle of the night. Though in retrospect, several neighbors would remember seeing a suspicious figure in the area in previous days. Mary Katherine was interviewed by police officers trained in speaking with child witnesses, but the trauma had affected her memory. She remembered the man's voice, remembered it sounded familiar but couldn't place it. She remembered his white robes, his threats, his knife. But the darkness of the room and her own terror had prevented her from seeing his face clearly. The officers were patient, gentle, but also persistent. Every detail mattered. What exactly had the man said? How tall was he? What did he smell like? Mary Katherine tried her best to answer, but her responses were fragmentary, inconsistent in places, confused by fear. The officers documented everything carefully, but even they could see that the 9-year-old's testimony, while critical, was compromised by trauma and limited observation. As dawn broke on June 5th, the scope of the crisis became fully apparent. News crews arrived, drawn by police scanners and the unusual nature of the crime. A child abducted from her bedroom in a safe, affluent neighborhood was exactly the kind of story that captivated media attention. Tom Smart, Elizabeth's older brother who worked as a news photographer, understood the power of media coverage. Despite his own shock and grief, he immediately began coordinating with journalists, providing them with recent photos of Elizabeth, pleading for the public's help. His professionalism in the face of personal tragedy was remarkable, and it would become a defining feature of the family's response to the crisis. Edward and Lois, meanwhile, struggled to process the nightmare. Edward, a man of deep faith and gentle nature, found himself overwhelmed by helplessness and fear. The thought of his innocent, though sheltered daughter in the hands of a violent stranger was unbearable. Lois clung to prayer, seeking divine comfort and guidance, but even her strong faith was tested by the horror of the situation. By midday on June 5th, the Smart home had become command central for a massive search operation. Volunteers began arriving, first dozens, then hundreds, then more than 1,000. The Mormon community, known for its tight-knit support networks, mobilized with impressive speed and efficiency. Tables were set up in the front yard to coordinate search parties. Maps were distributed showing different sectors to cover. Flyers with Elizabeth's photo were printed by the thousands. The outpouring of support was overwhelming and deeply moving for the Smart family, providing them with a lifeline of hope in their darkest hour. Lois stood in her front yard, watching strangers commit themselves to finding her daughter, and felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with her grief. Edward worked alongside the volunteers, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his determination unshakable. Every person who joined the search represented another set of eyes, another chance that Elizabeth might be found. The first press conference took place that afternoon, with Edward and Lois sitting at a table covered with microphones, cameras pointed at their anguished faces. Tom stood nearby, ready to support his parents, but also to manage the media presence. Edward's voice broke repeatedly as he pleaded for his daughter's safe return, as he begged anyone with information to come forward, as he promised that no questions would be asked if Elizabeth was simply returned unharmed. Lois, her eyes red from crying, spoke about Elizabeth's character, her kindness, her musical talent, her devotion to family and faith. She described the red pajamas Elizabeth had been wearing, hoping someone might have seen them. The image of this wholesome, innocent girl being torn from her family struck a chord with viewers across the nation. Elizabeth became a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare, and the case quickly gained national attention. Behind the scenes, however, tensions were already developing between the family and law enforcement. The police, following standard procedure in child abduction cases, began looking closely at family members. Statistics showed that in most cases involving missing children, someone close to the child was responsible. The officers' questions grew more pointed, more suspicious. Had there been any family conflicts? Any financial problems, any reason someone in the household might want Elizabeth gone. Edward and Lois were shocked by the implication but tried to cooperate fully, understanding that police had to eliminate all possibilities. They submitted to interviews, answered uncomfortable questions, and tried to maintain faith in the investigation. But as days passed without progress, their frustration grew. The volunteer search efforts continued with remarkable dedication. Every day, hundreds of people gathered at the Smart home to receive assignments, to search fields and canyons, to post flyers, to knock on doors. The community's commitment never wavered, even as hope began to dim. Elizabeth's face appeared on telephone poles, in store windows, on television screens across America. America's Most Wanted featured her case. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources and expertise. Yet, despite all these efforts, leads were scarce. A few reported sightings, all of which proved false upon investigation. Some tips from psychics, which police dutifully followed up on, but which led nowhere. The trail had gone cold almost immediately, and every passing day reduced the likelihood of finding Elizabeth alive. This grim statistical reality haunted everyone involved, though no one spoke it aloud in front of the family. Edward Smart's physical and emotional health deteriorated under the strain. About a week after the abduction, he collapsed and was hospitalized briefly. The doctor said it was exhaustion and stress, recommending rest. But rest was impossible. How could he rest when his daughter was missing? How could he eat or sleep or function normally when Elizabeth might be suffering unimaginable horrors? The thought tormented him constantly. Lois, meanwhile, found strength in her faith, spending hours in prayer, feeling what she described as a spiritual presence, assuring her that Elizabeth was alive, that she would return. This spiritual conviction sustained her when rational hope seemed impossible. She shared this feeling with friends and family, and while some might have dismissed it as desperate wishful thinking, those who knew Lois understood that her faith was genuine and deep. It wasn't denial, it was a profound spiritual assurance that transcended logic. The media coverage intensified, bringing both benefits and problems. On the positive side, Elizabeth's face became one of the most recognizable in America, increasing the chances that someone would spot her. On the negative side, the constant attention created pressure and sometimes spread misinformation. Rumors began circulating, wild theories about who had taken Elizabeth and why. Some speculated about a sexual predator targeting Mormon girls. Others suggested organized crime or human trafficking. A few cruel voices even implied that the family was somehow involved, that the whole abduction was staged. These rumors hurt the family deeply, adding to their anguish. Tom Smart worked tirelessly to control the narrative, to keep the focus on finding Elizabeth rather than on baseless speculation. But the media machine had a momentum of its own. About 10 days into the investigation, a new suspect emerged who would consume police attention for months. Richard Ricci. A handyman with an extensive criminal record, Ricci had worked for the Smart family several months before the abduction. He had been hired to help with home improvements, and during that time he had stolen items from the Smart home, jewelry and other valuables. The Smarts had discovered the theft and reported it to police, though they had been reluctant to press charges given Ricci's troubled background and their general inclination toward forgiveness. Ricci was on parole at the time of Elizabeth's abduction, having served time for a previous burglary conviction. When investigators looked at people with connections to the Smart home who also had criminal histories, Ricci's name rose to the top of their list. The case against Ricci began to build in the minds of investigators, even though the evidence was entirely circumstantial. He knew the layout of the Smart home. He had a history of breaking into houses. He had demonstrated a willingness to violate the Smarts' trust by stealing from them. Some of the stolen items had never been recovered, suggesting he might have hidden them somewhere, perhaps creating a hideout where he could have taken Elizabeth. Police brought Ricci in for questioning multiple times. He denied any involvement in the abduction, seemed genuinely shocked by the accusation, but his criminal history made his denials less credible to investigators. They subjected him to intense interrogation, looking for inconsistencies in his story, searching for any admission or slip that might confirm their suspicions. Mary Katherine was shown a photograph of Richard Ricci. Her response was uncertain, hesitant. The face looked somewhat familiar, but she couldn't definitively say whether he was the man who had taken Elizabeth. This ambiguity was interpreted different ways by different people. Some investigators saw it as confirmation. The girl recognized him but was too traumatized to commit fully. Others, including members of the Smart family, saw it as evidence that Ricci probably wasn't the right suspect. If he had been the abductor, surely Mary Katherine would have identified him more clearly, even accounting for trauma and darkness. But the police had invested significant resources in the Ricci theory, and they were reluctant to abandon it without a better alternative. The community's mood shifted as news of Ricci's status as the prime suspect became public. There was relief that police seemed to have a target, but also frustration that no arrest had been made. If Ricci had taken Elizabeth, where was he keeping her? Police executed search warrants on Ricci's property, on places he was known to frequent, on the homes of his associates. They found nothing connecting him to Elizabeth's disappearance. No physical evidence, no witnesses placing him near the Smart home on the night of the abduction. Nothing concrete. Yet investigators remained convinced, operating on the theory that Ricci was simply too clever, that he had hidden his tracks too well. This conviction would prove to be both the investigation's greatest weakness and a source of increasing tension between law enforcement and the Smart family. As the Ricci investigation proceeded, police also continued examining the Smart family itself with uncomfortable scrutiny. Edward Smart and his brothers were asked to undergo polygraph tests, a request that felt like a violation but which they complied with to demonstrate their innocence and cooperation. The polygraph sessions were grueling, lasting hours, designed to probe every aspect of their relationships with Elizabeth, their financial situations, their personal lives. Edward described the experience as degrading and painful, but he understood it was necessary. He passed the polygraph, as did his brothers, but the fact that he had been subjected to it at all became fodder for media speculation. If police were testing Edward, some reasoned, they must have had some reason to suspect him. Rumors of financial problems surfaced in news reports, suggesting a possible motive for a staged kidnapping. These reports were based on incomplete information and misunderstandings of the Smart family's financial situation. Edward worked in real estate, an industry with natural income fluctuations. The family lived comfortably but not extravagantly, and while they had typical middle-class financial obligations, mortgage, children's expenses, daily living costs, they were not facing any crisis that might motivate criminal behavior. Nevertheless, the rumors persisted, spread by tabloid-style media outlets hungry for sensational angles. The Smart family found themselves defending not only against an unknown abductor, but also against public suspicion that they themselves had somehow orchestrated Elizabeth's disappearance. The psychological toll on the family was immense. Every member dealt with the trauma differently. Tom threw himself into media coordination and investigative work, channeling his grief into action. Lois retreated into prayer and spiritual practice, finding solace in her faith community. Edward oscillated between determined optimism and crushing despair, his health continuing to suffer. Mary Katherine struggled with guilt, feeling she should have done more to save her sister, even though rationally she understood that a 9-year-old child could not have overpowered an armed adult. The younger siblings tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, attending school, playing with friends, but the shadow of Elizabeth's absence hung over everything. The house felt empty without her. Her harp sat silent. Her room remained untouched, preserved exactly as she had left it, a shrine to hope that she would return. Family therapy sessions were arranged by concerned friends and church leaders, though the Smarts were initially reluctant. They worried that admitting they needed psychological help might be seen as a weakness or might feed speculation about family dysfunction. Eventually, they recognized that processing trauma required professional support. The therapists helped them understand that their feelings, anger, guilt, helplessness, fear, were normal responses to an abnormal situation. They learned coping strategies, ways to support each other, and techniques for managing the relentless media attention. But no amount of therapy could erase the fundamental horror. Elizabeth was gone, possibly suffering, possibly dead, and they were powerless to help her. Less than 2 months after Elizabeth's abduction, Richard Ricci died unexpectedly while in custody for unrelated parole violations. The circumstances of his death were tragic and controversial. He had suffered a brain hemorrhage while in jail, collapsed, and despite medical intervention, never recovered. He died on August 30th, 2002, taking with him any secrets he might have held. For investigators who had focused intensely on Ricci as their prime suspect, his death was devastating. If he had been the abductor, they had lost their best chance of finding out where Elizabeth was being held. If he hadn't been involved, they had wasted precious time pursuing the wrong lead while the real abductor remained free. The Smart family received the news of Ricci's death with mixed emotions. There was sympathy for his family and for the tragedy of his death. There was also frustration that police had been so convinced of his guilt without solid evidence. Edward and Tom had been voicing concerns about the singular focus on Ricci for weeks, like suggesting that investigators needed to cast a wider net, but their concerns had been largely dismissed. Now, with Ricci dead and Elizabeth still missing, those concerns seemed prescient. The family's relationship with law enforcement became increasingly strained. They appreciated the efforts being made, but questioned the judgment and strategy directing those efforts. A peculiar incident occurred about 8 weeks after the initial abduction that briefly reignited investigative interest. At the home of Elizabeth's cousin, another attempted break-in was reported. The method was remarkably similar to Elizabeth's abduction: a cut screen, an attempt to enter through a window at night, a clear targeting of young girls in the household. Police investigated but couldn't definitively link this incident to Elizabeth's case. The would-be intruder had fled without taking anyone, frightened off by alert family members. Nevertheless, the similarities were striking enough to suggest either a copycat or possibly the same perpetrator. This incident demonstrated that whoever had taken Elizabeth might still be active, might be planning additional abductions, might be more dangerous than even the worst fears suggested. The summer of 2002 passed in agonizing slowness for the Smart family. Each day without Elizabeth felt like a lifetime. The initial flood of media attention began to recede as other stories dominated news cycles, though local coverage remained intense. The volunteer search efforts continued, but on a reduced scale as people returned to their normal lives. The Smarts understood this was inevitable. People had jobs, families, obligations. But it was still painful to watch the crowds of supporters dwindle. They never stopped searching themselves, never stopped advocating, never stopped praying. But the emotional exhaustion was profound. Living in suspended animation, unable to move forward, unable to go back, trapped in an endless present of not knowing. 4 months after Elizabeth's abduction, in October 2002, Mary Katherine experienced a sudden, powerful memory. The context was ordinary. She was at home, engaged in some routine activity, when suddenly she remembered where she had heard the abductor's voice before. It wasn't Richard Ricci. It wasn't anyone police had been investigating. It was a man named Emmanuel, a homeless street preacher who had briefly worked for the Smart family months before Elizabeth's abduction. Mary Katherine remembered him clearly now, his strange white robes, his intense religiosity, his unsettling presence, his voice. The voice that had whispered threats to Elizabeth in the darkness was Emmanuel's voice. She was certain. Mary Katherine rushed to tell her parents, the words tumbling out in an excited rush. She had remembered, she knew who it was. They had to tell police immediately. Edward and Lois listened with a mixture of hope and caution. Could this be real? After all this time, could Mary Katherine's memory suddenly provide the break they so desperately needed? They questioned her gently, wanting to ensure this wasn't wishful thinking or a false memory created by trauma. But Mary Katherine was adamant. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. Emmanuel had taken Elizabeth. She could hear his voice in her mind, and it matched perfectly with her memory of the abduction night. Edward Smart believed his daughter's revelation was divinely inspired. He had been praying for guidance, for any sign that might help find Elizabeth, and now his 9-year-old daughter had provided an answer. It felt like a miracle, a response to months of desperate prayer. He immediately contacted the police to share this new information. His expectation was that investigators would shift their focus immediately, would begin an intensive search for this Emmanuel character, would finally pursue the right lead. The reality was more complicated and disappointing. Police listened to Mary Katherine's new statement, but remained skeptical. They had invested so much time and energy in the Ricci theory, and even though Ricci was dead, they weren't convinced he hadn't been involved somehow. Perhaps he had an accomplice. Perhaps Elizabeth had already been killed. Perhaps Mary Katherine's new memory was the confused recollection of a traumatized child who desperately wanted to help, but whose mind was playing tricks on her. Nevertheless, police did follow up on the lead. They arranged a formal interview with Mary Katherine, bringing in specialists trained in forensic interviewing of child witnesses. Mary Katherine described Emmanuel in detail: his appearance, his behavior when he had worked for the family, his strange religious talk, his intensity. She explained how he had done odd jobs around the house for a few hours, how he had seemed strange but harmless at the time, how her parents had given him food and money out of kindness, how he had left and they hadn't seen him again until the night he returned to take Elizabeth. The description was vivid and consistent. Mary Katherine even recalled that Emmanuel had said he was working on his own religious texts, that he considered himself a prophet, that he lived a nomadic lifestyle. All of these details would later prove accurate, but at the time investigators remained cautious about pursuing this new angle aggressively. The Smart family, frustrated by what they perceived as police reluctance to fully pursue the Emmanuel lead, decided to take matters into their own hands. Tom Smart, with his media background and investigative instincts, began researching Emmanuel independently. He started by trying to find anyone who knew the man, who had interacted with him, who might have information about his current whereabouts or his real identity. Emmanuel was clearly an assumed name, probably connected to the man's religious delusions. But who was he really? Where did he come from? Where might he be now? Tom's investigation uncovered important information relatively quickly. Emmanuel was known in Salt Lake City's homeless community as a street preacher with unusual religious ideas. He was often seen in white robes, sometimes accompanied by a woman, also dressed in robes. They would preach on street corners, talk about revelation and prophecy, and generally be dismissed as harmless religious eccentrics. Several people remembered them, though no one knew much about their background or where they stayed. They seemed to move around frequently, never staying in one place long. Some remembered that Emmanuel had spoken about living in the mountains, about survival training, about being prepared for the end times. These details began painting a picture of someone far more complex and potentially dangerous than the simple homeless man the Smarts had briefly employed. The Smart family organized a press conference to release a sketch of Emmanuel to the public. This decision was controversial. Police were concerned that publicizing a suspect too early might cause him to flee or go into deeper hiding. But the Smarts felt they had no choice. 4 months had passed with no progress. If Emmanuel had Elizabeth, every day mattered. They needed the public's help identifying him and locating him. The sketch artist worked with Mary Katherine to create a composite image based on her memories. When the sketch was complete and released to media, it showed a bearded man with intense eyes and an unusual appearance. The Smart family pleaded with the public. If anyone recognized this man, if anyone knew who Emmanuel really was or where he might be, please contact police immediately. The public response to the Emmanuel sketch was significant, but initially unhelpful. Dozens of tips poured in, but most were vague or led nowhere. People thought they might have seen someone matching the description, but couldn't be sure. Others called in with theories or speculation, but no concrete information. The police followed up on credible leads, but found nothing definitive. Nevertheless, the sketch served an important purpose. It planted Emmanuel's face in the public consciousness. Now thousands of people were watching for him, and if he appeared in public, the chances of recognition increased dramatically. The Smart family clung to this hope. They had a face, they had a name, even if it was an alias, and they had Mary Katherine's certainty. It felt like progress, like finally moving in the right direction after months of circling in the dark. Behind the scenes, Tom Smart continued his own investigation with relentless determination. He contacted homeless shelters, interviewed street people who might have encountered Emmanuel, visited places where he was known to have preached or panhandled. Tom was operating largely outside official channels, driven by fraternal love and investigative instinct. He knew that finding Elizabeth required someone willing to follow unconventional leads, to take risks, to pursue hunches that police procedure might not allow. His efforts would eventually prove crucial, but in October and November of 2002, success still seemed frustratingly distant. Every lead ended in disappointment. Every promising tip faded into nothing. Elizabeth remained missing, and the question of whether she was even still alive hung unspoken but ever present in everyone's minds. While the Smart family and law enforcement searched desperately for Elizabeth, she was enduring a nightmare beyond their worst imaginings. On the night of her abduction, Bryan David Mitchell had forced her at knifepoint to walk through the darkness to a camp he had prepared in the mountains above Salt Lake City. The walk was long, treacherous, and terrifying. Elizabeth, wearing only her red pajamas, stumbled over rough terrain, her feet cut and bleeding. Mitchell and his accomplice, Wanda Barzee, showed no sympathy for her suffering. They told her that she had been chosen by God for a special purpose, that she should feel honored to be part of their divine mission. Elizabeth was too terrified to respond, too focused on survival to process the insanity of their claims. The camp was a carefully concealed shelter in a remote area, hidden among trees and rocks, invisible from nearby hiking trails. Mitchell had prepared this location in advance, stocking it with supplies, creating a space where he could hold Elizabeth without discovery. Upon arrival, Mitchell performed what he called a marriage ceremony, a grotesque religious ritual that he used to justify and sanctify his intentions toward Elizabeth. Wanda Barzee participated in this ceremony, he playing the role of witness and blessing this union that was actually a kidnapping and preparation for sexual assault. Elizabeth was forced to change out of her pajamas into white robes similar to those her captors wore. Her identity was immediately attacked. She was told her name was no longer Elizabeth Smart, but Augustine, that her former life was over, that she belonged to Mitchell now as his wife in the eyes of God. The first sexual assault occurred within hours of her arrival at the camp. Mitchell justified it with religious rhetoric, claiming he was consummating their divine marriage, that this was God's will, that Elizabeth should submit willingly as part of her spiritual transformation. Elizabeth resisted initially, but Mitchell's threats were explicit. If she resisted or tried to escape, he would kill her family. He described in graphic detail how he would kill them, her mother, her father, her siblings, everyone she loved. And he convinced her that he not only had the will to do this, but also the means. Elizabeth made a calculated decision in that moment. She would survive by complying. Resistance would only bring more violence and might get her family killed. Compliance, however horrible, kept everyone alive. This terrible calculation would govern Elizabeth's behavior for the next 9 months. The psychological manipulation began immediately and intensified daily. Mitchell employed techniques that broke down Elizabeth's sense of self and replaced it with learned helplessness and total dependence. He told her she was evil, that no one would want her back now that she was defiled, that her family would be ashamed of her, so that returning home was impossible. He alternated between claiming to love her and threatening to kill her, keeping her constantly off balance, unable to predict his moods or actions. Wanda Barzee reinforced these messages, sometimes acting as a fellow victim who encouraged Elizabeth to accept their situation. Other times serving as Mitchell's enforcer, ensuring Elizabeth's compliance through threats or actual violence. The two captors worked together to create a totalizing environment where escape seemed impossible and resistance futile. The routine of captivity was designed to maximize control and minimize hope. Elizabeth was kept shackled to a metal cable when Mitchell and Barzee were away from camp, preventing her from fleeing. The cable was long enough to allow her to move within the immediate camp area, but not long enough to reach any trails or roads where she might signal for help. When her captors were present, she was watched constantly, never allowed privacy, never permitted a moment where she might plan or attempt escape. Mitchell instituted a bizarre daily routine that included lengthy religious instruction sessions where he would read from his self-written religious texts, explaining his theology, describing his divine mission, and reinforcing Elizabeth's role in his delusional system. These sessions were mind-numbing in their repetition and grandiosity, but they served Mitchell's purpose of occupying Elizabeth's mind and wearing down her psychological resistance. Food was scarce and often inadequate. Mitchell and Barzee would occasionally leave the camp to panhandle or steal supplies, but Elizabeth was always left behind, shackled and alone. During these absences, she would sometimes hear search parties in the distance, helicopters overhead, voices calling her name, the sounds of organized searching. These moments were torture. Hope surged that she might be found, followed immediately by crushing despair when the sounds faded without discovery. Elizabeth considered calling out, but feared Mitchell's threats about killing her family. She couldn't risk it. She convinced herself that the searchers would eventually find the camp, that she just needed to wait and survive. But days passed, then weeks, and the search sounds became less frequent. The world moved on without her. The sexual abuse was frequent and brutal. Mitchell used religious justification to normalize what was actually serial rape. He told Elizabeth that multiple wives were part of God's plan for him, that she should feel privileged to be chosen, that her body was now his to use as he saw fit. Elizabeth dissociated during these assaults, training herself to mentally separate from what was happening to her body. This psychological defense mechanism allowed her to survive experiences that might otherwise have broken her completely. She thought about her family, about her faith, about music and beauty and everything good in the world she had lost. She told herself that this was temporary, that somehow she would survive, that she would see her family again, even though Mitchell's psychological manipulation made her doubt this possibility more with each passing day. So Wanda Barzee's role in Elizabeth's captivity was complex and disturbing. Sometimes she seemed sympathetic to Elizabeth's suffering, offering small kindnesses or gentler treatment than Mitchell provided. At other times, she was actively cruel, jealous of Mitchell's attention to Elizabeth, enforcing rules with harsh punishments. Barzee had her own history of mental illness and had been completely subsumed by Mitchell's religious delusions. She believed genuinely that Mitchell was a prophet, that his revelations were authentic, that their lifestyle and actions were divinely ordained. This sincere belief made her perhaps even more dangerous than Mitchell in some ways. She couldn't be reasoned with or appealed to through normal human empathy because she genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose. After several months in the Utah mountains, Mitchell made the decision to relocate to California. This decision was driven partly by paranoia. He worried that the mountain camp might eventually be discovered despite its excellent concealment, and partly by his nomadic nature and desire to preach to new audiences. The journey to California was another ordeal for Elizabeth. They traveled by hitchhiking and on foot, always in their white robes, always with Elizabeth veiled to hide her face. Mitchell told anyone who asked that they were a religious family on a spiritual journey, and most people accepted this explanation without question. The sight of religious eccentrics was common enough in the American West that few people looked twice. In California, they settled in Lakeside, a small community east of San Diego. The area had a substantial homeless population and a culture of tolerance for unusual religious expression, making it an ideal location for Mitchell to blend in. They set up camp in brushy areas outside town, living off the land and panhandling for money. Mitchell would preach on street corners, Wanda beside him, Elizabeth always veiled and silent. Mitchell presented her as his daughter when convenient, or his wife when that served his purposes better. Elizabeth learned to play her role, to stay silent, to draw no attention to herself. The veils served multiple purposes. They hid her identity from potential recognition. They symbolized her religious subjugation in Mitchell's theology, and they prevented her from making eye contact with strangers who might notice her distress. Life in Lakeside followed a similar pattern to the mountain camp, but with more public exposure. They frequented libraries where Mitchell would use computers to research religious topics or look up news about Elizabeth's case. He enjoyed seeing the ongoing search efforts, enjoyed knowing that he had successfully evaded detection for months. This grandiosity was typical of Mitchell's personality. He saw himself as supremely clever, divinely protected, destined for importance. Elizabeth would sit in the library, surrounded by normal people living normal lives, and feel the surreality of her situation. She was so close to potential help, yet utterly unable to seek it. Mitchell's threats about her family remained vivid in her mind, and beyond that, he had succeeded in convincing her that she was too ruined, too contaminated by her experience, for anyone to want her back. Several times during their California stay, Elizabeth was within feet of potential rescuers. Police in San Diego stopped Mitchell for minor infractions, trespassing, loitering, disturbing the peace. Each time Elizabeth was present, veiled and silent. Officers would look at this odd religious family and see nothing that raised alarms. Mitchell's explanation of their lifestyle was always ready. They were missionaries. They were on a spiritual journey. They had taken vows of poverty and simplicity. The officers would issue warnings or citations and move on. Elizabeth would watch these interactions with a complex mix of emotions. Hope that somehow the officers would see through the deception, relief when they didn't, because it meant Mitchell wouldn't have reason to carry out his threats, despair at another missed opportunity for rescue. The psychological conditioning was so complete by this point that even when help was literally in front of her, she couldn't bring herself to reveal her identity. In November 2002, Mitchell's behavior finally resulted in more serious legal consequences. He was arrested in San Diego on charges related to burglary and vandalism, accumulated from various incidents during their time in California. This arrest represented the best chance yet for Elizabeth's discovery, though no one realized it at the time. Mitchell was booked into the San Diego jail system and held for 3 days. Wanda and Elizabeth were left to fend for themselves, camping rough in the areas they had been occupying. For Elizabeth, Mitchell's absence was both terrifying and tantalizingly hopeful. Without his immediate presence, his threat seemed less real. But Wanda was still there, still watching, still enforcing the psychological prison, even when the physical one had expanded. The tragedy of this arrest was that it represented a massive failure of interagency communication. Salt Lake City police had identified Bryan David Mitchell as a person of interest following the Smart family's public release of the Emmanuel sketch and subsequent tips identifying him. A warrant had been issued. Mitchell's sister, shocked by the sketch and the growing suspicion around her brother, had anonymously contacted police with his real identity. But this information hadn't been properly disseminated to other jurisdictions. The San Diego police who arrested Mitchell had no idea he was connected to a high-profile kidnapping case in Utah. They saw him as just another transient, causing minor problems. They processed him, held him for the mandated period for his offenses, and then released him with time served and a warning. When Mitchell was released after 3 days, he returned to find Wanda and Elizabeth where he had left them. His first action was to reassert control, to remind Elizabeth of his threats, to ensure she understood that his temporary absence hadn't changed anything. Then he made the decision to leave California. The arrest had spooked him. He worried that police might be watching him more closely now, might connect him to other crimes, might dig deeper into his background. It was time to return to Utah, where he knew the terrain better, where he had established hideouts, where he could move more freely. The journey back was another grueling ordeal for Elizabeth, but by this point in her captivity, she had learned to endure, to dissociate, to survive one day at a time without thinking too far ahead. Back in Utah by early 2003, Mitchell resumed his pattern of moving between mountain camps and brief forays into populated areas. They were seen occasionally by hikers or residents, always in their distinctive white robes, always explained away as religious eccentrics. Mitchell grew bolder, perhaps feeling that he had successfully evaded capture for so long that he was untouchable. He began taking Elizabeth into more public settings, libraries, shopping centers, parks. She was always veiled, always silent, but the increased public exposure meant increased risk of recognition. Mitchell seemed to enjoy this risk, feeding his grandiosity and sense of divine protection. He believed truly that God was shielding him, that his mission was too important to be interrupted by human authorities. The beginning of 2003 brought renewed energy to the search for Elizabeth, driven largely by the Smart family's continued advocacy and the public's sustained interest in the case. The release of the Emmanuel sketch had generated hundreds of tips, though most led nowhere. Tom Smart continued his independent investigation, following up on leads that police might have dismissed or deprioritized. His work ethic was exhausting. He barely slept, spent every waking hour chasing down information, interviewing people, mapping out places where Emmanuel/Mitchell might frequent. His family worried about his health and sanity, but Tom was driven by a singular focus: bringing his sister home. One breakthrough came from an anonymous tip, later revealed to be from Mitchell's own sister. She had seen the Emmanuel sketch on television and immediately recognized her brother Bryan. The resemblance was unmistakable despite his beard and unusual appearance. She wrestled with the decision to come forward. Turning in family was an agonizing choice, but ultimately her conscience demanded it. She contacted police with Mitchell's real identity and background, providing critical information that began filling in the picture of who this Emmanuel really was. Mitchell's history of sexual deviance, his previous crimes, his mental health issues, his religious obsessions. All of this suddenly became available to investigators. Tom Smart received this information through his own channels and immediately understood its significance. Bryan David Mitchell wasn't just some random homeless person. He was a dangerous individual with a history that made Elizabeth's continued captivity even more horrifying. Tom compiled a dossier on Mitchell, gathering everything he could find: arrest records, family interviews, acquaintance statements, patterns of behavior. He mapped out places Mitchell was known to frequent, places he had lived before, places he might hide. This independent investigation ran parallel to the official police work, but with more urgency and less bureaucratic constraint. Tom was willing to follow hunches that official procedures might not allow. The Smart family held another press conference, this time with Mitchell's real name and more detailed information about his background. They pleaded with the public to be vigilant, to report any sightings, to understand that this wasn't a harmless, religious eccentric, but a dangerous criminal holding their daughter captive. The family's visible anguish moved viewers across the nation. Edward Smart, his health visibly declined from months of stress, spoke with raw emotion about missing his daughter, about the daily agony of not knowing whether she was alive or suffering. Lois shared her unshakable faith that Elizabeth was alive, that she would return, that God would bring her home. Their message resonated, generating another wave of public attention and tips. On March 12, 2003, Elizabeth's 9-month ordeal approached its end through a combination of luck, vigilance, and divine providence, depending on one's perspective. Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth were walking through Sandy, Utah, a suburb south of Salt Lake City, when they were spotted by two different sets of witnesses whose alertness would prove crucial. The first witnesses were a couple who had been following Elizabeth's case closely and who had seen the recent publicity about Mitchell. Something about the robed trio struck them as odd. The veiled figure between the two robed adults seemed out of place, seemed uncomfortable, seemed possibly female and possibly young. The man's appearance matched descriptions they had seen of Bryan David Mitchell. They didn't approach, but instead called 911 immediately, providing detailed descriptions and a location. The second witness was even more crucial. Nancy Merkel and her family, driving through Sandy, noticed the unusual trio walking along the street. Nancy's instincts screamed that something was wrong. The veiled figure walked with a posture suggesting youth and possibly distress. The entire scene felt off. Nancy convinced her husband to turn the car around and approach the group. What happened next was a combination of brilliant intuition and bold courage. Nancy engaged Mitchell in conversation, asking who they were, where they were going, making small talk that was actually careful interrogation. Mitchell was smooth, rehearsed in his explanations, presenting their religious mission with practiced ease. But Nancy wasn't satisfied. She focused on the veiled figure, speaking directly to her, asking her name. Elizabeth, speaking through her veil, said her name was Augustine. Her voice trembled slightly, and Nancy detected uncertainty. Of fear, perhaps. Nancy pressed, gently but persistently. "Where are you from? How old are you? Are you okay?" Elizabeth's responses were brief, compliant with Mitchell's cover story, but her body language told a different story. Her hands shook. Her breathing was rapid. Nancy saw tears forming in the girl's eyes, visible even through the veil. Nancy made a decision in that moment. This was Elizabeth Smart. Every instinct she possessed screamed it. She told Mitchell and his group to wait, that she was calling police, that she wanted to make sure everyone was safe. Mitchell's demeanor changed subtly, his friendly religious act becoming more defensive, but he didn't flee. Perhaps he truly believed God would protect him, or perhaps he understood that running would confirm guilt. Police arrived within minutes, responding to multiple 911 calls, reporting possible Elizabeth Smart sightings at the same location. Officers approached cautiously, aware that if this was actually Elizabeth, the situation was delicate. They separated Mitchell and Barzee from the veiled figure, beginning to question each person individually. Mitchell insisted they were a religious family doing missionary work, that they had every right to be on the public street, that the officers had no cause to detain them. The officers, trained and careful, persisted in their questions. They asked the veiled girl her name, and she repeated that she was Augustine. They asked her age, her parents' names, where she lived. Her answers were vague, rehearsed sounding, clearly coached. But her visible distress was increasing. Finally, one officer asked the question directly. "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" There was a long pause. Elizabeth later described that moment as crystallization, as 9 months of psychological conditioning suddenly confronting the possibility of freedom. Mitchell's threats echoed in her mind. His promises that no one would want her back warred with her desperate desire to go home. She thought of her family, of whether they had truly been searching for her or had forgotten her, as Mitchell claimed. The officer asked again, more gently, "You can tell us. Are you Elizabeth Smart?" And Elizabeth, her voice barely a whisper, said yes. That single word ended her captivity and began her recovery. Officers immediately took her into protective custody, arrested Mitchell and Barzee, and contacted the Smart family with news that would seem miraculous after 9 months of prayer and searching. The Smart family received the phone call they had prayed for, but hardly dared believe would come. Elizabeth had been found. She was alive. She was safe. The emotional explosion that followed was beyond description. Edward Smart collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude and disbelief. Lois's faith was vindicated. She had known, had felt spiritual assurance all along that Elizabeth would return. Tom immediately began coordinating logistics, arranging transport, managing the inevitable media circus that would follow. The younger siblings were told their sister was coming home, and their joy was pure and uncomplicated by the adult awareness of what Elizabeth must have endured. The reunion itself took place at a police facility rather than at home, necessary for investigative and practical reasons, but deeply frustrating for a family desperate to embrace their daughter. When Elizabeth walked into the room where her family waited, the scene was emotionally overwhelming. She was physically changed, thinner, pale, her hair matted and dirty, her expression haunted. But unmistakably, Elizabeth. Edward reached her first, wrapping her in his arms, unable to speak through his tears. Lois was next, holding Elizabeth's face in her hands, searching her daughter's eyes, seeing trauma there but also recognition and relief. Mary Katherine approached tentatively, guilty and awed that her memory had been correct, that she had helped bring her sister home. The siblings piled in, everyone talking at once, crying, laughing, thanking God. Elizabeth's responses during this initial reunion were muted. She smiled, hugged her family, said she loved them, But there was a distance in her manner, a shell that 9 months of captivity had built around her emotions. She was physically present, but psychologically still processing, still transitioning from the nightmare of captivity to the surreal reality of rescue. The family understood, giving her space even within their embrace, trying to be patient even though their desire was to shower her with attention and never let her out of their sight again. Police needed to conduct preliminary interviews, medical professionals needed to examine her, procedures had to be followed despite the family's wish to simply take Elizabeth home immediately. The media descended with predictable intensity. Within hours, satellite trucks surrounded the police facility and the Smart home. News anchors interrupted regular programming to announce Elizabeth's recovery. The story dominated every news cycle, with talking heads analyzing every detail, speculating about what she had endured, debating how she could have been hidden for so long. The Smart family issued a brief public statement through Tom, thanking everyone who had searched, everyone who had prayed, everyone who had never given up hope. They asked for privacy as they helped Elizabeth begin her recovery. This request was honored imperfectly. Media attention would continue for weeks, but the public's response was overwhelmingly positive and respectful. The immediate aftermath of her rescue, Elizabeth underwent medical examination and forensic interviewing by trained specialists. The medical findings were heartbreaking, evidence of malnutrition, physical abuse, and repeated sexual assault. The doctors and nurses who examined her maintained professional composure while documenting injuries and collecting evidence, but internally they were devastated by what this child had endured. Elizabeth was patient through these procedures, understanding they were necessary, but clearly eager to be done with them and allowed to go home. The medical team recommended ongoing counseling and treatment, providing referrals to specialists experienced in trauma recovery. The forensic interviews were careful and methodical. Investigators needed to gather evidence that would support prosecution of Mitchell and Barzee, while also being sensitive to Elizabeth's trauma. She provided basic information about her captivity, where she had been held, how she had been moved, what her captors had done to her, but was reluctant to go into extensive detail. This reluctance would continue and would be respected by her family and advocates. Elizabeth had the right to keep the most private, most painful aspects of her experience confidential. What mattered for prosecution were the basic facts. She had been kidnapped, held against her will, assaulted repeatedly, and prevented from escaping through threats and psychological manipulation. These facts were established clearly and would be sufficient for legal proceedings. Elizabeth's return home was delayed by practical concerns and protective measures. The Smart house had been under constant media surveillance since the abduction, and bringing Elizabeth home would create a mob scene. Police coordinated a careful transportation plan, eventually taking her home late at night to minimize exposure. When Elizabeth finally walked through the door of her own home, for the first time in 9 months, the emotional impact was profound. Everything was familiar yet strange, preserved exactly as she had left it, yet feeling like it belonged to a different person. Her room was unchanged, her harp in the corner, her books on shelves, her clothes in the closet, a time capsule of the girl she had been. Elizabeth sat on her bed, touched her belongings, and began crying, releasing emotions she had kept carefully controlled during the official processes of rescue and examination. The family's initial focus was entirely on Elizabeth's comfort and wishes. They let her set the pace for everything, what she wanted to eat, when she wanted to sleep, whether she wanted company or solitude. They discovered that Elizabeth needed time to readjust to normal life, that things they took for granted, privacy, choices, safety, were novel and sometimes overwhelming for her. She was accustomed to constant supervision, to having no decisions of her own, to living in perpetual fear. Freedom was wonderful, but also disorienting. The family consulted with trauma specialists who helped them understand that recovery would be a long process, that patience and unconditional support were essential. The community's response to Elizabeth's return was overwhelmingly positive. Neighbors placed ribbons on trees and signs on lawns welcoming her home. Local businesses displayed congratulatory messages. The Mormon Church, which had been central to the search efforts, held special services of thanksgiving. Thousands of people who had never met Elizabeth personally felt invested in her recovery, having followed her case for 9 months. This outpouring of support was touching and helpful to the family, providing a cushion of goodwill and assistance as they navigated the challenges ahead. But it also created pressure. Everyone wanted to know how Elizabeth was doing, wanted details about her experience, wanted her story. The family worked hard to create boundaries, to protect Elizabeth's privacy while also expressing gratitude for the sustained public interest that had helped bring her home. Bryan David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were charged with multiple felony counts, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and burglary. The cases against them appeared straightforward. There was physical evidence, Elizabeth's testimony, the circumstances of their arrest with Elizabeth in their custody. But complications arose immediately around issues of mental competency. Mitchell's behavior in court was bizarre and disruptive. He would sing hymns loudly, interrupt proceedings with religious proclamations, refuse to acknowledge the court's authority. His attorneys argued that he was mentally ill, unable to understand the proceedings or assist in his defense, and therefore not competent to stand trial. The competency evaluation process was lengthy and frustrating for the Smart family and prosecutors. Mitchell was sent to mental health facilities for evaluation, with different experts reaching different conclusions about whether his behavior represented genuine mental illness or deliberate malingering designed to avoid prosecution. Some evaluators believed Mitchell suffered from delusional disorder and genuinely believed himself to be a prophet receiving divine revelations. Others concluded that while Mitchell might have some mental health issues, he was fundamentally aware of his actions, understood that society considered them wrong, and was capable of assisting in his defense. The legal system struggled to reconcile these competing assessments. Wanda Barzee faced similar competency questions, but with somewhat different considerations. Her attorneys argued that she had been dominated by Mitchell, that she was herself a victim of his psychological manipulation, that she had acted under his control rather than of her own free will. While this argument had some merit, Barzee clearly was under Mitchell's influence, it also faced the hard reality that she had actively participated in Elizabeth's captivity and abuse. She had helped kidnap Elizabeth, had facilitated the assaults, had enforced control through threats and actions. Determining her level of culpability versus victimization was legally and ethically complex. The Smart family watched these proceedings with growing frustration. They wanted justice, wanted Mitchell and Barzee held accountable, wanted the legal system to recognize the horror of what had been done to Elizabeth. Instead, they faced delays, psychiatric evaluations, competency hearings, and the possibility that neither defendant would ever face trial. Edward Smart spoke publicly about his disappointment with a system that seemed to prioritize the rights of criminals over the rights of victims. This criticism resonated with many observers who shared his frustration. The tension between protecting defendants' rights and ensuring victim justice is always difficult, and in this high-profile case, every decision was scrutinized and debated publicly. As months and then years passed, Elizabeth Smart made the remarkable decision to become a public advocate for child protection and crime victims' rights. This decision was controversial within her own family. Some members worried that public exposure would hinder her healing, but Elizabeth felt called to use her experience to help others. She testified before Congress in support of the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, a legislation that established a national sex offender registry and improved systems for tracking and monitoring convicted predators. Her testimony was powerful and dignified, describing her experience without sensationalism, making clear the vulnerabilities children face and the need for systematic protective measures. Elizabeth's advocacy extended to support for other kidnapping victims and survivors of sexual assault. She became involved with non-profit organizations working in these areas, lending her name and story to raise awareness and funds. She was careful about how much detail she shared, always maintaining boundaries around the most private aspects of her experience. But she was willing to be public about the fact of her survival and recovery. This public role served multiple purposes. It helped other victims feel less alone. It educated the public about the realities of kidnapping and psychological manipulation. It kept pressure on the legal system to take crimes against children seriously, and perhaps most importantly for Elizabeth herself, it gave meaning to her suffering by transforming it into a platform for positive change. The media requests were constant and often insensitive. Everyone wanted an exclusive interview with Elizabeth Smart, wanted her to describe in detail what Mitchell had done to her, wanted the sensational story. The family refused most of these requests, granting only carefully selected interviews to outlets they trusted to be respectful. Elizabeth gave a few high-profile interviews in which she controlled the narrative, speaking on her own terms about her experience and recovery. These interviews were significant public events, with millions of viewers tuning in to hear directly from her. Elizabeth handled these appearances with remarkable composure, showing both the trauma she had endured and the strength she had developed in surviving it. In 2006, 3 years after her rescue, Elizabeth received a national award for courage from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She attended the ceremony with her family, accepting the recognition with characteristic humility. In her acceptance speech, she emphasized that she wasn't special, that any victim could recover with proper support, that the real heroes were the people who never gave up searching for her. This generosity of spirit, this refusal to claim victimhood as an identity, characterized Elizabeth's public presence. She acknowledged what had happened to her, but refused to be defined by it, while insisting on moving forward rather than remaining stuck in the past. After years of legal delays and competency evaluations, Bryan David Mitchell was finally ruled competent to stand trial in 2010, 7 years after Elizabeth's rescue. The trial was held in federal court, prosecuted under federal kidnapping statutes. Elizabeth testified, describing her abduction and captivity in clinical but clear terms. Her testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial, with jurors visibly affected by her account of 9 months of captivity and abuse. Mitchell continued his disruptive behavior during the trial, singing hymns and making religious proclamations until he was eventually removed from the courtroom and required to watch proceedings via video feed from another room. The defense strategy of claiming insanity was ultimately unsuccessful. While Mitchell clearly had mental health issues and delusional beliefs, the prosecution successfully argued that he understood his actions were illegal, that he had taken elaborate steps to avoid detection, and that he had demonstrated the calculating behavior of someone who knew he was committing crimes. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning a verdict: guilty on all counts. Mitchell was sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. The Smart family attended the sentencing hearing, with Edward Smart delivering a victim impact statement describing the devastation Mitchell had caused to their family and praising Elizabeth's courage in surviving and testifying. Wanda Barzee's case followed a different trajectory. She eventually pleaded guilty to federal and state charges in exchange for a 15-year sentence. Her cooperation with prosecutors and her perceived role as a secondary player influenced the negotiated plea. Barzee was released from prison in 2018 after serving her sentence, causing significant concern among the Smart family and the public about her release into the community. Elizabeth Smart publicly expressed opposition to Barzee's release, arguing that she remained dangerous and unrehabilitated. This public advocacy demonstrated Elizabeth's continued engagement with the case and her commitment to protecting other potential victims. The conclusion of the legal proceedings brought a sense of closure for the Smart family, though they acknowledged that true healing was an ongoing process that transcended legal outcomes. High justice had been served in the conventional sense. The perpetrators were convicted and imprisoned. But the family understood that no legal verdict could undo the harm that had been done or restore the innocence that Elizabeth had lost. The legal system had done its job eventually, but the process had been long, frustrating, and sometimes re-traumatizing for Elizabeth, who had to repeatedly recount her experiences for investigators, evaluators, and ultimately a jury. Elizabeth Smart's recovery and adjustment in the years following her rescue has been remarkable by any standard. She resumed her education, eventually attending Brigham Young University, where she studied music. She returned to playing the harp, finding that music provided emotional expression and healing. She reconnected with friends. Though some relationships were complicated by the shared knowledge of her experience and the difficulty of knowing what to say or how to act, Elizabeth chose to maintain privacy about many aspects of her recovery, sharing only what she felt comfortable sharing and insisting on her right to keep the most painful details confidential. In 2012, Elizabeth married Matthew Gilmore in a private ceremony attended by close family and friends. The wedding represented a significant milestone in her recovery, demonstrating her ability to form healthy relationships and build a normal life despite her traumatic past. The couple has since had children, with Elizabeth embracing motherhood as part of her healing journey. She has spoken publicly about the additional challenges of parenting as a survivor of sexual assault. See about the fears and protective instincts that her experience created, and about her determination to give her children a safe and happy childhood. Elizabeth's ongoing advocacy work has expanded to include public speaking, foundation work, and continued support for legislation protecting children. She published a memoir in 2013 titled My Story, which provided her own account of her abduction, captivity, and recovery. The book was a bestseller and introduced her story to a new generation. Elizabeth has also worked as a correspondent for crime stories, using her platform to bring attention to missing persons cases and to advocate for victims' rights. This professional work represents her commitment to transforming personal tragedy into public service. The Smart family as a whole has worked to move forward while acknowledging the lasting impact of Elizabeth's abduction. Edward and Lois have spoken about how the experience changed them, strengthened their faith in some ways while also forcing them to confront questions about suffering and divine intervention. Tom Smart continued his advocacy and investigative journalism work. Mary Katherine has maintained privacy about her role in the case, living her own life away from public attention. The younger siblings have grown up with their sister's kidnapping as a defining family event, but have worked to develop their own identities separate from that experience. The case's legacy extends beyond the Smart family to impact public policy and awareness around child safety. The intense media coverage and public interest helped drive legislative changes and increased funding for missing children investigations. The case highlighted the importance of listening to child witnesses like Mary Katherine, whose crucial identification of Mitchell was initially dismissed or undervalued. It demonstrated the power of sustained public attention and family advocacy in keeping missing persons cases active. And perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth's recovery and advocacy provided hope to other families facing similar tragedies, showing that survival and healing were possible even after the worst imaginable experiences. As the story concludes, viewers are reminded of the key lessons from Elizabeth Smart's case. The power of hope sustained the Smart family through 9 months of uncertainty. Of the importance of community support mobilized thousands of volunteers to search and pray and never give up. The role of family advocacy, particularly Tom Smart's independent investigation, complemented official efforts and maintained pressure when the investigation seemed to stall. The resilience of the human spirit, embodied in Elizabeth's survival and recovery, demonstrated that even profound trauma could be overcome with proper support and personal determination. And finally, the case illustrated ongoing challenges in the justice system around mental competency, victim rights, and balancing the need for due process with the need for accountability. The narrative ends where it began, with the Smart family in their Salt Lake City home. But now, years later, changed by their experience but also strengthened, Elizabeth is shown living her life, raising her children, continuing her advocacy, refusing to be defined solely by what happened to her. The family gathers for prayers, just as they did on the night of June 4th, 2002, but now with the hard-won knowledge that comes from surviving nightmare and finding hope on the other side. Elizabeth's story is not just about victimization, but about courage, resilience, faith, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. If you found Elizabeth Smart's incredible story of survival and resilience moving and inspiring, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that explore both the darkness humans are capable of and the light of those who survive. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts about this case, about Elizabeth's courage, about the lessons we can learn from her experience. And please like this video to help others discover this story of hope triumphing over horror. Thank you for watching, and remember that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit's capacity for recovery and renewal remains extraordinary.